Hello, hello. Welcome back to my channel, Monique Josephine. We left off abruptly last time. I was unexpectedly interrupted by my husband, but what we were talking about is that JD's Pawpa has passed away, and they held two different memorial services, one in Ohio, one in Kentucky. And JD is just talking about how even in death, his pawpaw had one foot in Ohio and one foot in the holler. So we're going to pick up right there without any delay because this book is taking longer than it should, and I want to get through it so that we can get on to, other interesting books. Not that this one isn't interesting. I am just so excited about this channel and the things that I want to share with you that I am kind of getting ahead of myself. So let's carry on. Everyone I cared to see came to the funeral in Jackson. Uncle Jimmy, his kids, our extended family and friends, and all of the Blanton men who were still kicking. It occurred to me as I saw these titans of my family that for the first 11 or so years of my life, I saw them during happy times. Family reunions, holidays, or lazy summers and long weekends, and the two most recent years I'd seen them only at funerals. That stings. At Papa's funeral, as at the other hillbilly funerals I've witnessed, the preacher invited everyone to stand up and say a few words about the deceased. As I sat next to Uncle Jimmy in the pew, I sobbed throughout the hour-long funeral with my eyes so irritated by the end that I could hardly see. Oh my gosh, you can only imagine how devastating losing his papa was. Still, I knew this was it, and that if I didn't stand up and speak my piece, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So, if you have been to a funeral and had to speak in front of people, oh my goodness, it is the most terrifying responsibility and pressure you could place on someone. But when you're in that position, you want to pay tribute to the people that you love. Oh, I remember my Aunt MJ, my Aunt Mary Jane passed away. She was so special to me, and I sobbed and could not speak. It was sad, but I still felt like she kind of had her hand on me throughout me expressing to everyone how important she was. So, yeah. I thought about a moment nearly a decade earlier that I'd heard about but didn't remember. I was 4 or 5, sitting in a church pew for a great uncle's funeral in that same Deaton funeral home in Jackson. We had just arrived after a long drive from Middleton, and when the minister asked us to bow our heads and pray, I bowed my head and passed out. Mama's older brother, Uncle Pet, lay me down on my side with a Bible as a pillow, and thought nothing more of it. Sorry, let's do that again. Mama's older brother, Uncle Pet, lay me on my side with a Bible as a pillow and thought nothing more of it. I was asleep for what happened next, but I've heard some version of it 100 times. Even today, when I see someone who attended that funeral, they'll tell me about my hillbilly mama and papa. I love the way he says that, and you can feel the pride that he feels when he says hillbilly. It's kind of like using the term redneck or white trash. It's like it's an endearing term, and I've never heard hillbilly used that way, but I can feel it reading these words, how much pride the word hillbilly following the people that he loved is a true term of endearment that people would only be as so honored to be called a hillbilly by our beloved JD Vance. When I failed to appear in the crowd, wait, sorry. Even today, when I see someone who attended that funeral, they tell me about my hillbilly Mawma and Pawpa. When I failed to appear in the crowd of mourners leaving the church, Mawma and Pawpa grew suspicious. There were perverts in Jackson, they told me, who wanted to stick sticks up your butt and blow on your pecker. As much as the perverts in Ohio or Indiana or California. Pawpa hatched a plan. There were only 2 exits to Deaton's, and no one had driven away yet. Pawpa ran to the car, grabbed a .44 Magnum for himself and a .38 Special for Mawma. They manned the exits to the funeral home and checked every car. When they encountered an old friend, they explained the situation and enlisted help. When they met someone else, they searched the cars like goddamn DEA agents. Uncle Pet approached, frustrated that Mawma and Pawpa were holding up traffic. When they explained, Pet howled with laughter. He's asleep in the church pew. Let me show you. After they found me, they allowed traffic to flow freely once again. I thought about Pawpa buying me a BB gun with a mounted scope. He placed the gun on his workbench with a vise to hold in place and fire repeatedly at a target. After each shot, we adjusted the scope, aligning the crosshairs with where the BB impacted the target. And then he taught me how to shoot, how to focus the sights on not the target, how to focus on the sights and not the target, how to exhale before pulling the trigger. Years later, our Marine boot camp marksmanship instructor would tell us that kids who already knew how to shoot performed the worst because they'd learned improper fundamentals. That was true with one exception, me. Oh, this could bring just tears to my eyes. From Pawpa, I had learned excellent fundamentals, and I qualified with an M16 rifle as an expert. The highest category with one of the highest scores in my entire platoon. God, that I'm sure it just validates so much of what he already knew about his Pawpa. Pawpa was gruff to the point of absurdity. To every suggestion or behavior he didn't like, Pawpa had one reply: bullshit. That was everyone's cue to shut the hell up. His hobby was cars. He loved buying, trading, and fixing them. One day, not long after Pawpa quit drinking, Uncle Jimmy came home to find him fixing an old automobile on the street. He was cussing up a storm. These goddamn Japanese cars, cheap pieces of shit. What a stupid motherfucker who made this part. I just listened to him, not knowing a single person was around, and he just kept carrying on complaining. I thought he sounded miserable. Uncle Jimmy had recently started working and was eager to spend his money to help his dad out. So he offered to take the car to the shop and get it fixed. The suggestion caught Pawpa completely off guard. What? Why? He asked innocently. I love fixing cars. Pawpa had a beer belly and a chubby face, but skinny arms and legs. He never apologized with words. While helping Aunt Wee move across the country, she admonished him, for his earlier alcoholism and asked why they rarely had the chance to talk. Well, talk now. We've got all fucking day in the car together. But he didn't apologize with deeds. Sorry. He did apologize with deeds. The rare times when he lost his temper with me were always followed with a new toy or a trip to an ice cream parlor. Papaw was a terrifying hillbilly, made for a different time and place. During that cross-country drive with Aunt Wee, during that cross-country drive with Aunt Wee, they stopped at a highway rest stop early in the morning. Aunt Wee decided to comb her hair and brush her teeth, and thus spent more time in the ladies' room than Pawpaw thought reasonable. He kicked open the door holding a loaded revolver like a character in a Liam Neeson movie. He was sure, he explained, that she was being raped by some pervert. Later, years after, Aunt Wee's dog growled at her infant baby. Papaw told her husband Dan that unless he got rid of the dog, Papaw would feed it a steak marinated in antifreeze. He wasn't joking. 3 decades earlier, he had made that same promise to a neighbor after a dog nearly bit my mom. A week later, that dog was dead. In that funeral home, I thought about these things too. These are the most endearing memories that he has of his papa and the type of person that he was, and how this hillbilly justice, albeit unethical and anything but fair and balanced, it's just so admirable, and it does highlight the very best of these people and their true intentions. Like him busting in that rest stop bathroom looking for his granddaughter, ready to do whatever it took to defend her, is just, it is a person that was built for another time. But also, those type of events teach us about the people that we love from a different generation. What my dad used to always say was, when someone did something, you're like, all right, add them to the list. As if there was this time in the future that that list reached a point where it was, just well done enough that he could go out and take action on it, knowing damn well he would if given the opportunity, or if there was a severe enough misnomer done to anyone in his family, anyone he loved, especially any of his daughters. So I just love the undertone of this and how much respect and he's handling this story with so much precision to make sure that you get the view of his family that he holds so dear to his heart. Most of all, I thought about Papa and me. I thought about the hours we spent practicing in increasingly complex math problems. He taught me that lack of knowledge and lack of intelligence were not the same. The former could be remedied with a little patience and a lot of hard work. And the latter, well, I guess you're up shit creek without a paddle. I thought about how Papa would get on the ground with me and Aunt Wee's baby girls and play with us like a child. Despite his bullshit and his grouchiness, he never met a hug or a kiss that he didn't welcome. He bought Lindsay a crappy car and fixed it up, and after she wrecked it, he bought her another one and fixed that one up too, just so she didn't feel like she came from nothing. Gosh. I thought about losing my temper with Mom or Lindsay or Mama. and how those were the few times Papa ever showed a mean streak. Because, as he once told me, these are just such valuable lessons. The measure of a man is how he treats the women in his family. His wisdom came from experience, from his own earlier failures with treating women in his family well. Gosh, oh my God. I think that it really hits so hard because of my dad. You know, he was so old school. You know, the type that would literally beat us if we aimed a pop gun at each other. He would, it was just the biggest infraction to aim a fake gun at each other because he knew that one day, we'd all have our own guns and you just can't carry a weapon like that. But not only that, he had absolutely no patience for anyone who would mistreat a girl. And I'll just tell a quick story because it's just so deep, near and dear to my heart. And that's why I think I started with this book, is because it just hits so close to home for me, for my family. I would consider us being white trash. And this just has so many of the rhymes to my family that it's kind of that reminder that I need about where I come from and how beautiful it is with all of the flaws that it's steeped in. Um, but so my dad, when he passed away, this is the quick story I just want to tell about my dad. We were collecting his guns, making sure we had them all, and we were missing one. And, we all checked our homes just in case, because if anything popped off at any of his kids' houses, especially, actually only his daughters, he would send us home with a weapon. And so we all checked. We're like, no, we don't have it. And my nephew, Robbie, who spent a lot of time with my dad, he was like, oh, the lady downstairs, we heard when, Pop and I were here, we heard her and her boyfriend fighting really loudly, and Pop dropped a gun off at her apartment. And we all, oh, it was such a sweet and warm reminder of who my dad is through and through. Such a man's man, but there was no excuse or no punishment too harsh for someone who would hurt a woman. And yeah, we all love that story so much because it encapsulates the type of person that my dad was, and how great that my nephew got to witness exactly who he was. And he actually has so many traits just like my dad. And gosh, yeah, I miss that. Even the way he says his papa was cussing fixing the car, that's literally my dad. Would just bunch up all the cuss words, not even making sense, but we just all knew it was like, he's on one, guys. Okay, I'm done because I am going to be a full mess if I keep thinking. Whew. I stood up in that funeral home, resolved to tell everyone just how important he was. Okay, so one more thing. And I'm sorry, I know I said I wanted to get through this book and I just continue, but that's what is so hard for me to do, that I feel like I take from this book. It's the resolve to communicate to people how important the people in my family are. And JD has found the words that helped me express that. And I think I said that in my opening chapter, but I just wanted to reiterate that because it might be surprising or shocking to people when I just bust out crying when I hear these things about how his, you know, the measure of a man is how he treats the women in his family. Okay. So let me start again. I stood up in that funeral home, resolved to tell everyone just how important he was. I never had a dad, I explained, but Papa was always there for me. And he taught me the things that a man needed to know. Then I spoke the sum of influence of his, then I spoke the sum of his influence on my life. He was the best dad anyone could ever ask for. After the funeral, a number of people told me that they appreciated my bravery and courage. Mom was not among them, which struck me as odd. When I located her in the crowd, she seemed trapped in some sort of trance, saying little. Even to those who approached her, her movements slow and her body slouched. Mawma, too, seemed out of sorts. Kentucky was usually the one place where she was completely in her element. In Middleton, she could never truly be herself. At Perkins, our favorite breakfast spot, Mama's mouth would sometimes earn a request from the manager that she keep her voice down or watch her language. That fucker, she'd mutter under her breath. Chastised and uncomfortable. But at Bill's Family Diner, the only restaurant in Jackson, the only restaurant in Jackson we're sitting down at for a meal, she'd scream at the kitchen staff to hurry the hell up, or they'd laugh and say, "Okay, Bonnie." Then she'd look at me and tell me, "You know I'm just fucking with them, right? They know I'm not a mean old bitch." In Jackson, among old friends and real hillbillies, she needed no filter. At her brother's funeral a few years earlier, Mama and her niece Denise convinced themselves that one of the pallbearers was a pervert, so they broke into his funeral home office and searched through his belongings. They found an extensive magazine collection, including a few issues of Beaver Hunt, a periodic a periodical that I can assure you has nothing to do with aquatic mammals. Mamaw found it hilarious. "Fucking beaver hunt," she'd roar. "Who comes up with this shit?" She and Denise hatched a plot to take the magazines home and mail them to the pallbearer's wife. After a short deliberation, she changed her mind. "With my luck," she told me, "we'll get into a crash on the way back to Ohio and the police will find these damned things in my trunk. I'll be damned if I'm going to go out with everyone thinking I was a lesbian." And a pervert one at that. So they threw the magazines away. Teach that pervert a lesson. And never spoke of it again. This side of Mamaw rarely showed itself outside of Jackson. Deaton's funeral home in Jackson, where she'd stolen those beaver hunts, was organized like a church. In the center of the building was a main sanctuary, flanked by larger rooms with couches and tables. On the other two sides were hallways with exits to a few smaller rooms, offices for staff, and a tiny kitchen and bathrooms. I've spent much of my life in that tiny funeral home, saying goodbye to aunts, uncles, cousins, great grandparents, or, great grandparents, And whether she went to Deaton's to bury an old friend, a brother, or her beloved mother, Mamaw greeted every guest, laughed loudly, and cursed proudly. So it was a surprise to me when during Papa's visitation I went searching for comfort and found Mama alone in a corner of the funeral home, recharging batteries that I never knew could go empty. She stared blankly at the floor, her fire replaced with something unfamiliar. I knelt before her and laid my head in her lap and said nothing. At that moment, I realized that Mama was not invincible. In hindsight, it's clear that there was more than grief to both Mama and Mom's behavior. Lindsay, Matt, and Mama did their best to hide it from me. Mama forbade me to stay at Mom's under the ruse that Mama needed me with her as she grieved. Perhaps they hoped to give me a little space to mourn Papa. I don't know. I didn't see at first that something had veered off course. Papa was dead, and everyone processed it differently. Lindsay spent a lot of time with her friends and was always on the move. I stayed close to Mama as I stayed as close to Mama as possible and read the Bible a lot. Mom slept more than usual, and I figured this was her way of coping. At home she lacked even modicum of temper control. Lindsay failed to do the dishes properly or forgot to take out the dog, and Mom's anger poured out. My dad was the only one who really understood me, she'd scream. I've lost him, and you're not making this any easier. Mom had always had a temper, though, so I dismissed even this. Mom seemed bothered that anyone but her was grieving. Aunt Wee's grief was unjustified because Mom and Papa had a special bond. So too was Mama's, for she didn't even like Papa and chose not to live under the same roof. Lindsay and I needed to get over ourselves, for it was Mom's father, not ours, who had just died. It was Mom's father, not ours, who had just died. The first indication that our lives were about to change came one morning when I woke and strolled over to Mom's house, where I knew Lindsay and Mom were sleeping. I went first to Lindsay's room, but she was asleep. I'm gonna do that. Okay. I went first to Lindsay's room, but she was asleep in my room instead. I knelt beside her, woke her up, and she hugged me tightly. After a little while, she said earnestly, We'll get through this, Jay. That was her nickname for me. I promise. I still have no idea why she slept in my room that night, but I would soon learn what she promised we'd get through. A few days after the funeral, I walked into Mamaw's front porch, looked down the street, and saw an incredible commotion. Mom was standing there in a bath towel. Mom was standing there in a bath towel in her front yard, screaming at the only people who truly loved her. To Matt, you're a fucking loser, nobody. To Lindsay, you're a selfish bitch. He was my dad, not yours. Stop acting like you just lost your father. To Tammy, her unbelievably kind friend who is secretly gay, the only reason you act like my friend is because you want to F me. I ran over and begged Mom to calm down. But by then, a police cruiser was already on the scene. I arrived on the front porch as a police officer grabbed Mom's shoulders and she collapsed on the ground, struggling and kicking. Then the officer grabbed Mom and carried her to the cruiser. She fought the whole way. There was blood on the porch, and someone said she tried to cut her wrists. I don't think the officer arrested her, though. I don't know what happened. Mama arrived on the scene and took Lindsay and me with her. I remember thinking that if Papa were here, he'd know what to do. Papa's death cast light upon something that had previously lurked in the shadows. Only a kid could have missed the writing on the wall, I suppose. A year earlier, Mom had lost her job at Middleton Hospital after rollerblading through the emergency room. I cannot imagine. At the time, I saw Mom's bizarre behavior as a consequence of her divorce from Bob. Similarly, Mama's occasional reference to Mom getting loaded seemed like random comments of a woman known for her willingness to say anything, not a diagnosis of a deteriorating reality. Not long after Mom lost her job, during my trip to California, I heard from her once. I had no idea that behind the scenes, the adults, meaning Mama on the one hand and Uncle Jimmy and his wife, Donna, on the other, were debating whether I should move permanently to California. Mom flailing and screaming in the street was the culmination of the things I hadn't seen. She'd begun taking prescription narcotics not long after we moved to Prenville County. I believe the problem started with a legitimate prescription, but soon enough, Mom was stealing from her patients and getting so high, turning an emergency room into a skating rink seemed like a good idea. Papa's death turned a semi-functioning addict into a woman unable to follow the basic norms of adult behavior. In this way, Papa's death permanently altered the trajectory of our family. Before his death, I had settled into the chaotic but happy routine of splitting time between Mom's and Mama's boyfriends, came and went. Mom had good days and bad, but I had an escape route. With Papa gone and Mom in rehab at the Cincinnati Center for Addiction Treatment, or the Cat House as we called it, I began to feel myself a burden. Though she never said anything to make me feel unwanted, Mama's life had been a constant struggle. From the poverty of the holler to Papa's abuse, from Aunt Wee's teenage marriage to Mom's rap sheet, Mama had spent the better part of her 7 decades managing crisis. And now, when most people her age were enjoying the fruits of their retirement, she was raising 2 teenage grandchildren. Without Papa to help her, that burden seemed twice as heavy. In the months after Papa's death, I remember the woman I found in an isolated corner of Denton's funeral home and couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what aura of strength Mama projected, that other woman lived somewhere inside of her. So instead of retreating to Mama's house or calling her every time problems arose with Mom, I relied on Lindsay and on myself. Lindsay was a recent high school graduate, and I had just started 7th grade, but we made it work. Sometimes Matt or Tammy bought us food, but we largely fended for ourselves. Hamburger helper, TV dinners, Pop-Tarts and breakfast cereal. I'm not sure who paid the bills. Probably Mama. We didn't have a lot of structure. Lindsay once came home from work to find me hanging out with a couple of her friends, all of us drunk. But in some ways, we didn't need it. When Lindsay learned that I got beer from a friend of hers, she didn't lose her cool or laugh at the indulgence. She kicked everyone out and then lectured me on substance abuse. We saw Mama often, and she asked about us constantly. But we both enjoyed the independence, and I think we enjoyed the feeling that we burdened no one except perhaps each other. That's probably one of the best times, in his life. You can only imagine that your older sibling is the actual ruler of the home and you get to eat Pop Tarts for dinner. Um, yeah. Lindsay and I had grown so good at managing crisis, so emotionally stoic, even as the very planet seemed to lose its cool, that taking care of ourselves seemed easy. Taking care of ourselves seemed easy. No matter how much we loved mom, our lives were easier with one less person to care for. Gosh, that's so sad because they literally had to care for their mom. Did we struggle? Certainly. We received one letter from the school district informing us that I had collected so many unexcused absences that my parents might be summoned before the school or even prosecuted by the city. We found this letter hilarious. One of my parents had already faced a prosecution of sorts and hardly possessed any walking around liberty, while the other was sufficiently off the grid. Summoning him would require some serious detective work. We also found it frightening. Without a legal guardian around to sign the letter, we didn't know what the hell to do. But as we had with other challenges, we improvised. Lindsay forged mom's signature, and the school district stopped sending letters home. On designated weekdays and weekends, we visited our mother at the cat house. Between the hills of Kentucky, Mama and her guns, and Mom's outbursts, I thought that I had seen it all. But Mom's newest problem exposed me to the underworld of American addiction. Wednesdays were always dedicated to a group activity of some sorts, some type of training for the family. All of the addicts and their families sat in a large room with each family assigned to an individual table, engaged in some discussion meant to teach us about addiction and its triggers. In one session, Mom explained that she used drugs to escape the stress of paying bills and to dull the pain of Papa's death. In another, Lindsay and I learned that standard sibling conflicts made it more difficult for Mom to resist temptation. These sessions provoked little more than arguments and emotion, which I suppose was their purpose. On the nights when we sat in that giant hall with other families, all of whom were either Black or Southern accented whites like us, we heard screaming, fighting, children telling their parents that they hated them, sobbing parents begging for forgiveness in one breath and then blaming their families in the next. It was there that I first heard Lindsay tell Mom how she resented having to play the caretaker in the wake of Papa's death instead of grieving for him. How she hated watching me grow attached to some boyfriend of Mom's only to see him walk out on us. Perhaps it was the setting, Or perhaps it was that Lindsay was almost 18. But as my sister confronted my mother, I began to see my sister as the real adult, and our routine at home only enhanced her status. Mom's rehab proceeded apace, and her condition apparently improved with time. Sundays were designated as unstructured family time. We couldn't take mom off site, but we were able to eat and watch TV and talk as normal. Sundays were usually happy, though mom did angrily chide us during one visit because our relationship with Mama had grown too close. "I'm your mother, not her," she told us. I realized that mom had begun to regret the seeds she'd sown with Lindsay and me. When mom came home, wait, first, I get the instinct to be kind of like butthurt about your children growing attached to your mother, but first of all, take 5 steps back with all of that and appreciate the fact that you have a mom that cares enough about you and the future of your children to step in. Also, understand that that's only the natural course. If your mom, their mama, is the one responsible taking care of them, making sure they're eating, making sure they have, a roof over their head, they're going to school, that they're all around taken care of course they're going to grow attached. And to get upset with them about that is just so childish. And I understand that she is recovering from addiction and that this kind of thinking would be acceptable or common in that community, but I come from a family of addiction, and my mom has been addicted my entire life. I actually found out that she started using drugs in 1989, the year that I was born, which actually led me to understand that I'd never even been around my mom as a sober person. So I get it, but I do resent her being upset with her children for growing attached to their mama when she is their literal lifeline and silver lining in everything that was going on. When mom came home a few months later, she brought a new vocabulary along with her. She regularly recited the Serenity Prayer, a staple of addiction circles in which the faithful ask God for the serenity to accept things they cannot change. Drug addiction was a disease. And just as I wouldn't judge a cancer patient for a tumor, so I shouldn't judge a narcotics addict for her behavior. At 13, I found this patently absurd, and mom and I often argued over whether her newfound wisdom was scientific truth or an excuse for people whose decision destroyed a family. Oddly enough, it's probably both. That's definitely where I fall in that spectrum. Research does reveal a genetic disposition to substance abuse, but those who believe their addiction is a disease show less of an inclination to resist it. Mom was telling herself the truth, but the truth was not setting her free. I didn't believe in any of the slogans or sentiments, but I did believe she was trying. Addiction treatment seemed to give mom a sense of purpose, and it gave us something to bond over. I read what I could on her disease and even made a habit of attending some of her Narcotics Anonymous meetings, which proceeded precisely as you'd expect: a depressing conference room, a dozen or so chairs, and a bunch of strangers sitting in a circle introducing themselves as Bob, I'm an addict. I thought that if I participated, she might actually get better. At one meeting, a man walked in a few minutes late, smelling like a garbage can. His matted hair and dirty clothes evidence a life on the streets, a truth he confirmed as soon as he opened his mouth. My kids won't speak to me. No one will, he told us. I scrounge together what money I can and spend it on smack. Tonight I couldn't find any money or smack, so I came here because it looked warm. The organizer asked if he'd be willing to try giving up the drugs for more than one night, and the man answered with admirable candor, I could say yes, but honestly, probably not. I'll probably be back at it tomorrow night. I never saw that man again. Before he left, someone did ask him where he was from. Well, I've lived here in Hamilton for most of my life, but I was born down in eastern Kentucky, Owsley County. At the time, I didn't know enough about Kentucky geography to tell that the man that he had been born no more than 20 miles from my grandparents' childhood home. Ooh, I get goosebumps. That concludes this chapter, and I will carry on for another minute just because this book is so powerful for people. There are, an uncountable number of families just like JD's in the US, whether hillbilly or not. My dad reminds me of a lot of Pawpa, and my mom reminds me a lot of Bev, my mom. And at the time, I remember when my mom was using drugs, and it's like you have no assurance, there's no conclusive evidence that, you know, you are the priority when you have a parent who's addicted. And it's so hard to describe. I almost think of it as like you're walking without knees, or trying to follow a leader who is walking without knees and just falling and falling and falling. And when you witness that kind of structure and upbringing of a household, I can only imagine the elbow grease that went into JD changing and becoming a person who could have a normal relationship, who is still to this day happily married to his wife, having 3 children. And he always says that's one of his greatest accomplishments, even as vice president. And I believe that to be the truest statement because that was probably the biggest hurdle to overcome. Academics, there's an outline of how to succeed academically, but there's no outline how to repair yourself from the dysfunction that you learn, and how all of those skills you learn trying to get through life in the first 18 years, those same skills that you used to survive don't serve you anymore. It's almost like being institutionalized in prison. Like, the skills that you need to survive in prison serve zero purpose when you get out of prison and you're living in the real world again. And relearning those structures is near impossible. So that's another aspect of this story that I just admire so much. And I admire how clearly he can put this into pages. And I know that it's so true because it's like you recognize it. And yeah, it's just portrayed in the most perfect sense in this book. I absolutely love it. And we will begin chapter 8 next. I will get to that this week, hopefully. and I would like to record the rest of this book this week so I can get regular on my uploads. I'm planning to upload twice a week and one news roundup. So be on the lookout for that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I will see you next time. Ciao.